I used to think the hardest part of growing up was figuring out what you wanted to do with your life. Turns out, the hardest part is what happens when you actually do it, and the people closest to you decide that your success somehow belongs to them. I'm Zachary. I'm 27 now, and before most of my friends had even finished paying off their student loans, I was debt-free, owned a modest home, and ran a small business my parents had openly laughed at when I first started it. I didn't inherit anything. I didn't get help. And according to my family, that was somehow my biggest crime. To understand why this all blew up the way it did, you have to understand my family dynamic. I'm the older sibling. My brother, Evan, is 2 years younger than me. Growing up, the roles were always clear, even if nobody ever said them out loud. Evan was the potential. I was the reliable one. Evan was encouraged to explore, to take risks, to find himself. I was encouraged to be practical, to help out, to not rock the boat. If Evan failed a class, it was because the teacher didn't see his talent. If I got a B instead of an A, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough. That pattern followed us into adulthood like a shadow nobody wanted to acknowledge. After high school, Evan went straight to a private college my parents could barely afford. They co-signed his loans without hesitation. When he switched majors 3 times, they said it was all part of the journey. When I told them I wasn't going to college right away and instead wanted to start a small online logistics business I'd been planning for over a year, they looked at me like I'd just announced I was joining a traveling circus. My dad laughed and asked when I planned on getting a real job. My mom told me it was fine to dream, but eventually I'd need to be realistic like Evan was being. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, explaining my spreadsheets, my projections, the contracts I was already negotiating. My dad waved it off and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." It lasted, quietly at first, then steadily, then faster than I ever expected. I worked constantly. Early mornings, late nights, weekends. I lived cheaply. I drove an old car. I didn't take vacations. Every dollar went back into the business or into savings. When I bought my first small house at 25, I didn't even tell my parents right away because I knew exactly how the conversation would go. When they eventually found out, my mom said, "That's nice," in the same tone she used when someone mentioned a neighbor's new lawn furniture. My dad asked if I was sure I hadn't overextended myself. Neither of them asked how I'd done it. Evan, on the other hand, graduated with a degree he didn't really use and a pile of debt he barely understood. He bounced between jobs. Some were his fault, some genuinely weren't. Every time something went wrong, my parents stepped in. Rent paid here, loan deferred there. When he moved back home at 24, they told everyone it was temporary. When he moved out again 6 months later and then back again, they stopped calling it anything at all. The first real crack appeared at a family dinner about a year ago. It was one of those forced gatherings where everyone pretends things are normal because the food is hot and nobody wants to start anything. My mom casually mentioned that Evan was going through a rough patch. Then she looked directly at me and said, "You've always landed on your feet. You were born like that." I laughed it off, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. Like my work, my sacrifices, my choices were just a personality trait. Luck, genetics, anything except effort. After dinner, my dad pulled me aside and asked how the business was doing. I told him it was stable, growing, nothing flashy. He nodded, then said, "You know, your brother could really use a break. Life hasn't been fair to him." I remember thinking, unfair compared to what? Compared to me? But I didn't say it. I just said I hope things improved for Evan. My dad sighed like I'd missed the point. Over the next few months, the comments became less subtle. My mom would mention Evan's stress whenever I talked about a new contract. My dad would joke that I should teach Evan your tricks. Evan himself started making comments that sounded half joking, half bitter. He'd say things like, "Must be nice to have everything figured out," or "Some of us didn't get lucky." I tried to help in small ways, resume advice, introductions, even offering short-term work. He declined most of it, said he didn't want handouts. At the time, I respected that. I didn't realize it was just laying the groundwork for something else. The situation escalated fast when Evan finally lost what my parents called everything. His car was repossessed. He defaulted on several loans. A landlord filed for eviction. Suddenly, the tone shifted from disappointment to urgency. My parents stopped hinting and started calling. Long calls, emotional calls, calls where my mom cried and my dad spoke in that tight, controlled voice he used when he was trying not to sound angry. They talked about family responsibility, about how we don't leave our own behind, about how Evan had potential and just needed support to get back on his feet. Then came the word that changed everything: compensation. My dad said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, that since I was so far ahead, it made sense for me to help balance things out, that my success created an obligation. I asked him what exactly he meant. He said Evan had fallen behind, and fairness meant I should help correct that. Not a loan, not advice, compensation. As if I'd taken something that belonged to Evan by succeeding faster. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to process the sheer audacity of it. I replayed every late night, every skipped event, every risk I'd taken alone while they funded my brother's experiments. I thought about how small I'd made myself around them just to keep the peace. And I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't new. They'd always seen me as a resource, not a person. Reliable, useful, there when needed. I told them no, calmly, clearly, no explanation beyond the fact that I didn't owe anyone compensation for my own life choices. That was when the real tension started. My mom said I was being cold. My dad said I was abandoning my brother. Evan stopped talking to me altogether. And then, one afternoon, I got a message from my father that made my stomach drop. He said they'd spoken to someone about making things fair officially, and that I should be prepared to explain myself if this went further. I stared at my phone, realizing for the first time that my family wasn't just disappointed in me anymore. They were preparing to force me to justify my success to people who didn't care about our history at all. That was the moment it stopped being a family argument and started becoming something else entirely. And I still hadn't heard the full logic they planned to use. After that message from my dad, the tone of everything shifted. Before, there had at least been the illusion that this was a misunderstanding, a few emotionally charged conversations that would cool off if I just stayed calm long enough. Now there was an edge to every interaction, like something sharp had been slipped under the surface. Phone calls stopped being about how Evan was doing and started being about what I was doing. My mom would ask questions that sounded casual but weren't. How much the business was making this quarter, whether I still had a mortgage, if I'd set anything aside for family. Every question felt like it was being written down somewhere. I started dreading my phone lighting up with their names. When I didn't answer right away, my mom would send follow-up texts about how worried she was. Worried about Evan. Worried about the family falling apart. Worried that I was changing. That one hurt more than I expected, because from her perspective, changing meant I was no longer willing to be quietly useful. I was still me. I was just finally saying no. Evan eventually reached out directly. It was a long message, more polished than I expected, which should have been my first clue. He talked about how humbling the past year had been, how he'd made mistakes, how he knew I'd worked hard, but that sometimes hard work still came with responsibility. He said he wasn't asking for charity. He said he just wanted fairness. That word again, fairness, as if life had handed us the same deck and I'd secretly stacked mine. He ended it by saying he hoped I'd do the right thing, not just for him, but for our parents' peace of mind. I didn't respond. I needed distance. I focused on work. I took on more projects than usual just to keep my brain occupied. But even there, the stress followed me. I'd catch myself rereading emails, distracted, wondering what my parents were planning next. Because by then, it was clear they were planning something. They weren't just venting anymore. They were organizing. The next family dinner was the breaking point. My mom insisted it was important, said we needed to sit down like adults and talk everything through. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me still wanted to believe that if I showed up calmly, if I explained myself clearly one more time, they'd finally hear me. I arrived early. Evan was already there, sitting at the table with a folder in front of him. A literal folder. My stomach dropped. Dinner itself felt surreal. Everyone was overly polite, like we were attending a meeting instead of eating a meal. Halfway through, my dad cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk about the situation. He used that phrase like we were discussing a leaky roof, not my life. He said they'd been doing a lot of thinking and had realized that the imbalance between me and Evan wasn't healthy for the family, that it bred resentment, that it created instability. He said families worked best when everyone was supported proportionally. I asked him what that meant. He gestured to the folder. Evan slid it across the table toward me. Inside were printed bank estimates, screenshots of property listings in my area, and a rough breakdown of what they believed my net worth was. Not accurate, but close enough to be terrifying. My mom washed my face carefully as I flipped through the pages, like she was gauging whether I looked guilty yet. Evan finally spoke and said they consulted someone about it. Not a lawyer, he clarified quickly. A financial advisor friend. Someone neutral. According to this person, my parents said, it was reasonable for me to provide financial compensation to Evan to equalize outcomes. I remember laughing, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. I asked them if they were serious. My dad frowned and said this wasn't funny. He said I'd benefited from circumstances Evan hadn't. I asked him to name one. He said I'd always been more disciplined. I pointed out that discipline wasn't an inheritance. My mom jumped in and said Evan had struggled emotionally. I asked when that became my responsibility. The room went quiet. Evan looked down at the table. My dad's jaw tightened. Then my mom said something that rewired the entire way I saw her. She said that when parents invest unevenly in their children, it's only fair that the child who overperforms helps correct that later. She said they'd spent more money on Evan because he needed it more, and that my success proved I didn't. Therefore, she said, it made sense for me to give back now. Not to them. To Evan. Directly. She said it like she was explaining gravity. I asked her if she heard herself. If she realized she was admitting they'd treated us differently, and now expected me to pay for it. She told me not to twist her words. She said I was being defensive because deep down I knew they were right. Evan finally looked up and said he didn't want this to turn ugly. He said he just wanted what he was owed as my brother. That word again. Owed. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. I told them I wouldn't pay a cent, that their logic was flawed, cruel, and frankly insulting. I said my success didn't create a debt, and their choices weren't mine to fix. My dad said if I walked away now, I shouldn't expect things to stay the same. I said they already weren't. I left before dessert. After that night, the pressure ramped up fast. My parents stopped pretending this was a discussion. It became a campaign. Extended family started reaching out, asking if everything was okay, dropping hints about how stressed my parents were. One had told me family meant sacrifice. An uncle said money changed people. I realized my parents had started telling their version of the story, and in it, I was selfish, arrogant, unwilling to help my struggling brother. Evan, apparently, was heartbroken. The real betrayal came a week later. I got an email from a mediation service I'd never heard of. The subject line included my name and the words, family financial dispute. My heart started pounding as I read it. My parents had formally initiated a mediation process, claiming that I had benefited from shared family resources and was refusing to equitably redistribute gains. They weren't suing me yet, but they were laying the groundwork, documenting, creating a paper trail, without telling me, without asking. I called my dad immediately. He didn't deny it. He said they had to protect Evan, that I'd forced their hand, that this was just a step to encourage me to be reasonable. I asked him how he could do this behind my back. He said I'd left them no choice. My mom took the phone and told me not to panic, that this could all be resolved easily if I just cooperated. She said I was making it bigger than it needed to be. I hung up and sat there in silence for a long time. I felt something crack inside me, something I hadn't realized I was still holding on to. The belief that, no matter how unfair they'd been, my parents ultimately cared about me as their son, not just as a solution. That belief died right there. They weren't trying to help Evan anymore. They were trying to force me into a role I'd never agreed to play. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every moment, every conversation, wondering how it had escalated so far without me noticing. By morning, the shock had turned into something colder, clearer. I realized that if they were willing to drag this into official channels, then I needed to stop treating it like a family disagreement. I needed to protect myself. I opened my laptop, started organizing my records, my timelines, my finances. And as I did, I noticed something in the mediation documents that made my chest tighten. They hadn't just listed my business and my house. They'd referenced an old savings account my grandparents had helped me open years ago, implying it was family money, not mine. That was when it hit me. They weren't just asking for compensation anymore. They were preparing to claim entitlement. And if they were willing to do that, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next few weeks were the lowest point of my adult life, and what made it worse was that, from the outside, nothing looked wrong. The business was still running. The house was still mine. My bank account wasn't empty, but inside, everything felt unstable, like the floor could give way at any moment. I'd wake up every morning with that familiar drop in my stomach, the one you get right before bad news. Except now it never went away. I was constantly bracing for the next email, the next call, the next escalation. I tried to keep working like nothing had changed. I told myself that if I stayed productive, if I focused hard enough, this would all fade into the background. That lasted about a week. I started missing details. I reread contracts 3 times and still felt unsure. I snapped at a long-term client over something minor and immediately regretted it. At night, I'd sit on the edge of my bed scrolling through old messages from my parents, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when concern turned into entitlement. I couldn't find it. It was like they'd always been walking in that direction, and I'd just finally noticed. The mediation service followed up with another email, politely worded, reminding me that participation was encouraged and that non-cooperation could be noted. The language was neutral, but the implication wasn't. I felt cornered. I talked to no one about it at first. Not friends, not coworkers. I was embarrassed. How do you explain that your own parents think your success belongs to your brother? That they're willing to put it in writing? Every time I tried to say it out loud in my head, it sounded unreal, like I was exaggerating. Eventually, the stress caught up with me physically. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I lost weight without trying. I'd forget to eat until my hands started shaking. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a darkened computer screen and barely recognized myself. I looked tired in a way that wasn't just lack of sleep. It was deeper, like something had been draining me for a long time, and I'd only just run out of reserves. The breaking moment came quietly. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet I'd built years ago, one that tracked every expense, every reinvestment, every decision that had led me here. I realized I'd built this entire life around proving something, that I wasn't irresponsible, that I wasn't lazy, that I was worth believing in, and the people I'd been trying to prove it to still didn't see me as enough. Worse, they saw me as a resource to be redistributed. That realization hurt more than any threat of legal action. It felt like grief, not just for the relationship I thought I had with my parents, but for the version of myself that had kept hoping things would eventually balance out. That if I just succeeded quietly enough, they'd come around. I closed the spreadsheet, leaned back in my chair, and let myself feel it fully for the first time. The anger, the sadness, the exhaustion. I didn't push it away. I didn't try to rationalize it. I just sat there and acknowledged that this was real, and it was happening, and it wasn't my fault. That was the fall, not the mediation emails, not the threats. The moment I accepted that my family dynamic wasn't going to magically fix itself if I kept sacrificing. Once that sank in, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden burst of confidence or clarity, but there was a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. If this was going to be a fight, I wasn't going to fight it from a place of guilt anymore. The rebuilding started with boundaries. Small ones at first. I stopped answering calls immediately. I replied to messages when I was calm, not when I was pressured. When my mom sent a long text about how stressed Evan was and how this was tearing the family apart, I didn't rush to reassure her. I replied with a short message saying I was taking time to consider my options and would communicate through appropriate channels going forward. Hitting send on that message felt terrifying and freeing at the same time. I also finally told someone, a friend I trusted, someone who knew me before the business, before the house. Saying it out loud to another human being made it real in a different way. He didn't interrupt. He didn't minimize it. When I finished, he just shook his head and said, "That's not normal, Zach." Hearing that mattered more than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I needed external confirmation that I wasn't being unreasonable. With his encouragement, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. I went in expecting to feel defensive, like I'd have to justify myself. Instead, the lawyer listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and then calmly explained what my parents were attempting to do. He said words like entitlement claims, lack of legal basis, emotional leverage. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded methodical. He told me that mediation didn't obligate me to anything, but documentation mattered. He advised me to stop informal communication and start treating this like a formal dispute, because that's what it had become. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the problem was solved, but because I finally understood the playing field. Knowledge replaced panic. Strategy replaced fear. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. I threw myself back into my work, but differently this time. Not as an escape, but as an anchor. I tightened processes, delegated tasks I'd been hoarding out of habit, cleaned up systems that had grown messy during the chaos. The business responded well. Revenue stabilized. A long-term client expanded their contract. These weren't miracles. They were reminders. Proof that I was competent, capable, and still in control of my own life. At home, I made changes too. I started exercising again, even when I didn't feel like it. I cooked real meals. I stopped scrolling through old family photos late at night, looking for signs that things had always been this way. I accepted that I didn't need to rewrite the past to justify the present. The present spoke for itself. My parents noticed the shift. My mom sent a message saying I seemed distant and asking if we could go back to talking like family. I didn't respond right away. When I did, I said I was open to respectful communication, but not pressure or assumptions. She replied with a sad face and said she hoped I remembered who had always been there for me. That line used to work. This time, it didn't. I recognized it for what it was, another attempt to pull me back into a role I'd outgrown. Evan broke his silence around then too. He sent a short message saying he never wanted things to go this far and that he felt caught in the middle. I read it several times. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part noticed that he still hadn't said the compensation idea was wrong. He still hadn't said he didn't want my money. He just didn't want the process to be uncomfortable. That told me everything I needed to know. As the weeks passed, my fear faded into something steadier. Confidence, maybe, or acceptance. I started seeing myself not as the problem they were trying to fix, but as the person who had finally stopped absorbing everyone else's dysfunction. I wasn't heartless. I wasn't selfish. I was just done paying for choices that weren't mine. Then, one evening, I received an official notice that changed the tone of everything again. The mediation service informed me that my parents had submitted additional documentation and were requesting to escalate the matter, citing refusal to cooperate. Attached was a summary of their claims, more detailed than before. They weren't just framing this as a family dispute anymore. They were positioning it as a moral obligation with financial implications, leaning heavily on shared history and implied promises I'd never made. I sat there, reading through it, feeling strangely calm. Because this time, instead of panic, my mind went straight to structure. Evidence, timelines. I thought about everything I'd documented, every choice I'd made independently, every time I'd been dismissed when I asked for support. I realized that if this did go further, if they really wanted to stand in front of someone neutral and explain their logic, they were going to have to say it out loud. All of it. The favoritism, the assumptions, the belief that my success was communal property. And for the first time, the idea didn't scare me. It sharpened me. I closed the document, picked up my phone, and sent a single message to my lawyer asking what the next steps would be if mediation failed. As I waited for the reply, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real confrontation hadn't even started yet. Not the emotional one. The kind where people are forced to hear themselves speak and realize how unreasonable they sound. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't falling anymore. And I wasn't going to be quiet when they finally had to explain themselves. Once my lawyer confirmed that mediation was likely to escalate whether I participated emotionally or not, we shifted gears. He told me something that stuck with me. People who rely on guilt and pressure tend to fall apart when they're forced to be precise. Vague accusations work in family conversations. They collapse under scrutiny, especially under oath. So we prepared. The first thing I did was stop thinking of my parents as parents in this situation. That sounds cold, but it was necessary. I had to see them as claimants, as people making assertions they would eventually need to support. Once I made that mental shift, the fog lifted. Their arguments stopped sounding overwhelming and started sounding thin. I began compiling everything, not emotionally, methodically. Bank statements going back years, business formation documents, tax filings, proof of mortgage payments, emails and messages where I'd explained my plans and been dismissed. Texts from my mom congratulating Evan on milestones while ignoring mine. Messages where my dad referred to my work as a phase. I didn't cherry pick. I built a timeline, a clean one. If anyone looked at it objectively, they'd see exactly who funded whom, who supported whom, and who built what on their own. What surprised me most was how grounding the process felt. Every document was a reminder that my life hadn't happened by accident, that I hadn't taken anything from anyone, that the narrative they were trying to construct required ignoring an enormous amount of reality. The more evidence I gathered, the calmer I became. My lawyer suggested something else too. He said that if this went beyond mediation, my parents would likely lean heavily on character arguments rather than financial ones. That I was successful, therefore capable of helping. That Evan was struggling, therefore deserving. That family implied obligation beyond contracts. He said we needed to be ready to dismantle that framing without sounding defensive. That meant witnesses, not people who would insult my parents or dramatize things. Just people who could calmly describe what they'd seen. Former co-workers who knew how much I worked. Clients who could speak to my professionalism. Even a distant relative who'd once quietly told me she admired how independent I'd become. We weren't building a spectacle. We were building contrast. I didn't tell my parents any of this. I stopped engaging entirely outside of formal channels. When my mom sent a long message about how mediation was meant to heal, not punish, I forwarded it to my lawyer and didn't reply. When my dad left a voicemail saying he didn't recognize me anymore, I saved it. Every attempt to pull me back into an emotional conversation became another data point. Another example of pressure replacing reason. Evan tried a different tactic. He showed up at my house one afternoon unannounced. I saw his car through the window and felt my chest tighten, but I didn't panic. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and kept the conversation on the porch. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. Tired, defensive, like someone who'd been rehearsing what to say and still wasn't sure it would work. He told me he didn't want this to turn into something ugly. He said our parents were stressed and scared. He said lawyers made everything worse. I asked him a simple question. Did he believe I owed him compensation for my success? He hesitated, long enough to answer without speaking. Then he said he believed families should help each other when there was an imbalance. I asked him if he'd ever planned to help me when I was building the business and struggling quietly. He didn't answer that either. I told him I loved him, but this wasn't a conversation we could have anymore. Not like this. Not on my porch. He looked frustrated, said I was hiding behind legalities. I told him boundaries weren't hiding. They were clarity. When he left, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not because he was gone, but because I hadn't folded. Behind the scenes, things moved faster. The mediation service officially noted the breakdown and informal resolution. My parents submitted a request to escalate. This time, it came with more confidence, more moral language, less math. Reading their statements felt like reading a script written for sympathy. They talked about sacrifice, about raising 2 sons and only seeing one succeed, about fairness and outcomes rather than opportunities. They framed my refusal as abandonment. My lawyer smiled grimly when he read it. He said this was exactly what we needed, because now their logic wasn't just implied. It was documented. We began preparing for the possibility of a formal hearing, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted them to hear themselves, to stand somewhere neutral and explain, clearly and slowly, why my discipline obligated me to pay for Evan's decisions, why their uneven support became my debt, why my independence somehow disqualified me from boundaries. I started rehearsing too, not speeches, but mindset. I practiced answering questions calmly. I worked on stripping emotion out of my explanations without losing honesty. I wasn't there to prove I was hurt. I was there to prove I was autonomous. At the same time, I quietly strengthened my position elsewhere. I refinanced part of the business structure to further separate personal and operational assets. I updated beneficiaries. I made sure everything that was mine was clearly, indisputably mine. Not because I expected them to win, but because I refused to leave room for interpretation. Friends noticed the change in me. I wasn't venting anymore. I wasn't spiraling. I was focused, grounded. One of them joked that I seemed scarier now than when I was angry. He wasn't wrong. Anger wants resolution. Clarity wants truth. My parents tried one last emotional push before things became fully official. My mom sent a message saying she didn't understand how things had gone so wrong and that she missed me. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply, to explain again, to soften the edges. Then I realized something important. Missing me wasn't the same as respecting me. And until those two aligned, nothing I said would matter. So I didn't reply. The final piece of the setup came quietly, almost anticlimactically. My lawyer informed me that if this proceeded, my parents would be required to formally articulate their claim in front of a judge. Not just that they felt wrong, but how. Not just that they wanted compensation, but why they believed they were entitled to it. He said judges didn't respond well to arguments based on resentment disguised as fairness. When I heard that, I felt a slow, steady sense of inevitability settle in. I wasn't orchestrating a trap. I was stepping aside and letting them walk forward with their own words. The day of the hearing didn't feel dramatic. There was no storm outside, no racing heartbeat, no cinematic sense that everything was about to change. It was quiet, ordinary. That alone told me how far I'd come. Months earlier, just seeing my parents' names in my inbox had made my chest tighten. Now, as I sat beside my lawyer in a plain courtroom, I felt steady, not numb. Steady. My parents arrived together. My mom looked smaller than I remembered, clutching her purse with both hands like it was an anchor. My dad wore the same expression he always did when he thought authority alone would carry him through. Rigid posture, tight jaw, eyes that didn't quite meet mine. Evan came too. He sat behind them, not close enough to look united, not far enough to look neutral. That felt fitting. When the judge entered, everything snapped into focus. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. This wasn't mediation language about healing and fairness. This was a place where words mattered because they had consequences. My parents' attorney began by outlining their position. He spoke carefully, using phrases like moral obligation and equitable consideration. He talked about shared upbringing, unequal outcomes, parental investment. He painted a picture where I had surged ahead while Evan fell behind, and where my refusal to assist had caused emotional and financial harm to the family unit. It sounded polished, convincing, if you didn't look too closely. Then the judge started asking questions. Simple ones at first. Did my parents provide funds to my business at any point? No. Did they co-sign loans for me? No. Did they contribute to my down payment? No. Did they provide ongoing financial support after I turned 18? No. Each answer landed quietly, but I could feel the air shifting. The judge then asked what specific agreement or promise existed that entitled Evan to compensation from me. My parents' attorney paused. He said there was no written agreement, but there was an implicit understanding rooted in family values. The judge nodded and asked what legal precedent supported enforcing implicit family expectations as financial obligations between adult siblings. There was no good answer to that. Then it was my parents' turn to speak directly. The judge asked them to explain, in their own words, why they believed my success created a debt. My dad stood. His voice was confident at first. He talked about sacrifice, about how they'd poured resources into both of us, about how Evan had struggled and I hadn't, about how families help each other. The judge interrupted gently and asked him to clarify something. Had they, as parents, chosen to invest more money in Evan than in me? My dad hesitated, then said yes, because Evan needed it more. The judge asked whether that decision had been made by me or by them. My dad said by them. The judge asked why that choice now obligated me to reimburse the outcome of it. My dad opened his mouth, then closed it. My mom spoke next. Her voice shook. She said she felt like she was losing her family, that she didn't understand why I'd become so distant, that it hurt to see one son thriving and the other drowning. The judge listened, then asked a question that changed everything. She asked my mom whether she believed that my independence and success were the result of luck or effort. My mom said both. The judge asked whether she believed Evan's struggles were entirely the result of unfair circumstances. My mom hesitated. She said no, not entirely. The judge asked whether I had caused those struggles. My mom said no. The judge leaned back and said something I'll never forget. She said empathy does not create entitlement, and love does not justify coercion. She said parents are allowed to feel pain over unequal outcomes, but they are not allowed to assign financial blame where no obligation exists. She said that what my parents were asking for was not fairness, but retroactive redistribution based on regret. Then she dismissed their claim completely. She ruled that there was no legal basis for compensation, no shared asset, no implied contract, no moral obligation enforceable by the court. She noted, explicitly, that attempting to pressure an adult child into financial transfers under threat of legal action was inappropriate and damaging. She advised my parents, in measured but unmistakable terms, to seek counseling rather than compensation. The room was silent. My mom started crying quietly. My dad looked stunned, like someone who'd walked into a wall he'd convinced himself wasn't there. Evan stared at the floor. No one looked at me. The judge turned to me and asked if I wished to say anything. I stood. My legs didn't shake. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I said I loved my family, but I would not accept responsibility for decisions I didn't make. That my success was not stolen from anyone. That I had tried to help without being controlled. And that when that wasn't enough, I had chosen self-respect. I sat back down. That was the revenge. Not humiliation. Not shouting. Not walking away with a dramatic speech. It was letting their logic stand in the open long enough for it to collapse under its own weight. The fallout came slower. My parents didn't apologize. Not really. My mom sent a message a few days later saying she hoped we could put this behind us someday. My dad didn't contact me at all. Evan sent a short text saying he never wanted it to go that far and that he felt embarrassed. I replied politely and wished him well. I didn't offer money. I didn't offer solutions. I offered distance. Extended family went quiet. The ones who'd pressured me before stopped calling. A few reached out privately to say they hadn't known the full story. I accepted that without bitterness. People see what they're shown. Life didn't magically improve overnight, but it stabilized. The background tension I'd been living with for years faded. I slept better. I worked better. I felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with money. The strangest part was realizing that I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished, like I'd closed a door I'd been holding open out of habit, not hope. A few months later, I ran into my parents at a family event. We were polite, distant. Something fundamental had shifted, and we all knew it. They no longer spoke to me like a resource. They spoke to me like someone they couldn't control, and that was enough. I didn't leave my brother behind. I stopped carrying him. And when a judge asked my parents to explain the difference, they finally heard how unreasonable it sounded. Some people think revenge has to be loud to be satisfying. I learned that the quiet kind lasts longer.